Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. If you go into the Civil War photograph collection at the Valentine Museum in Richmond, Virginia, you will find this wonderful glass plate negative. It's a copy negative that was made at some point in the 19th century. It was made from an original portrait that was made during the Civil War of Confederate Brigadier General Evander Law. He's in the middle, surrounded by his military family. The original of this image has been a mystery. It's been unknown until earlier this year, 2024, when it turned up at a Civil War collector show. That Civil War collector show was in South Boston, Virginia. It's about a 50 table show. It's run by Jerry Roxbury, who is a friend of mine. He is a collector of Confederate images, and both from the Army and the Navy, and swords and all kinds of artifacts. Jerry's been running this show for a while, and I thought I would go check it out. And I ordered a table and set up Military Images Magazine. That was back in February of 2024. Well, I happened to be set up just outside the main entrance, or I should say just inside the main entrance. If you walk in, I was on the left. On the other side of me was a very nice gentleman. His name was Craig Wofford. And I didn't really have much of a chance to talk with him in the beginning because people were coming into the show. You're behind a table. You're talking about the magazine and all of that. And so at some point during the show, someone came up to me and said, Craig has an image that you probably are going to want to see. And so eventually I struck up a conversation with Craig, and that was on a Saturday. And he said, I want you to see this image, but I have to get it. It's in a safe deposit box, but I brought it home for the weekend. So I said, okay, great. So Sunday, the second day of the show, he comes in and he has this big black case, and he opens up the case, and the first thing he pulls out is a field glass. It's a telescope, a brass telescope, and along the edge of the telescope is engraved Brigadier General Evander M. Law, the Confederate general. And then he pulls out a half-plate ambrotype, and you students of Civil War photography know that an ambrotype is an image on glass, and they were made beginning in the mid-1850s up until about the end of the war. So Craig opens up the case, and there is the original image made during the Civil War of Confederate Brigadier General Law and his military family. I was completely blown away. I had seen this image reproduced in books. I knew it was in the Valentine, but I assumed that the original image might have been lost sometime in the past. So here we have this original image, and I knew instantly that it was going to be a cover of military. Check out our summer issue. You will see this image right on the cover, and a cover story about the image and about Law, his early years in South Carolina and then Alabama, and then the early part of the war. So in this image, you'll see that Law wears a brigadier general's insignia. Let's take a close-up so you can have a look at that. Here he is. You can see he's got a brigadier general's insignia. There's a wreath around 3 stars on his collar, which is the tail. That's the bit of insignia that you want to look for a brigadier general. You'll also notice that his left arm, and of course, these images are reversed. So his right arm is actually his left arm, and you can see it just hanging at his side. That's a very visible reminder of the wound he received in the arm at the First Battle of Manassas. I found a description where there is a view of him after he was shot, and knocked off of his horse. One of the members of the regiment helped him to get out of there safely and saw Law getting back to his horse with blood streaming down his hand. So here we have this very visible reminder of the damage that was inflicted. So this particular image, this original, was passed down through the Law family to General Law's great granddaughter, a woman named Anne Daves Johnston Storm. Her nickname was Annie, and her life dates are 1899 to 1870. She died in Winter Haven, Florida. In 1995, this image and other items from the family, including that field glass I mentioned earlier, were offered through a private auction in Bartow, Florida. And that's where Craig Wofford, the collector at that time, a collector and getting into dealing, he was invited to place a bid, and he placed the winning bid. So it's been in his collection since 1995. So Craig and his wife Carol, they knew where the image was the entire time, but they kept it to themselves. And when I got a chance to see him at the show, he revealed it, and the rest is now history. We can now connect the dots. As I mentioned, this glass plate is in the Valentine, and it's part of the George Smith Cook Studio collection. Cook was active as a photographer in Charleston, South Carolina during the war, and he amassed a significant collection of Confederate portraits, making copies of these glass plates during the post-war period until the 19th. And in fact, the Valentine acquired the entire George Cook collection, more than 10,000 negatives and prints in 1954. Now, according to the Valentine description, etched along one side of the Cook negative is, quote, "common soldiers from Charles City County," end quote. A summary note states that the image shows a group of 5 Confederate soldiers posing in uniform, possibly General Evander M. Law, center and staff, from Charles City County, Virginia, and dates the image 1861 to 1865. The lack of specificity about this image has sparked some conversation and some theories about the date and the identity of the individuals. Keep in mind, only Law is known. The other 4 men assumed to be members of his staff. Now, a version of that glass plate negative from the Valentine was reproduced in 1996 in Robert Coles' History of the 4th Alabama from Huntsville to Appomattox. It's edited by Jeffrey D. Stocker. The caption with that photo in Stocker's book says, "Colonel Evander M. Law, taken in either late 1861 or early 1862 with other unidentified members of the 4th Alabama." The view of Law's head and his beard obscures much of that collar insignia, so it's understandable because those reproductions, those early reproductions, without being tinted, makes it really hard to see the wreath. So the 3 stars looks like that's all you can see, and that would be a colonel, which explains why it would be dated between 1861 and 1862. And in fact, Law is promoted to brigadier general in late 1862. So there's that little detail. In 2019, a few years later, Robert Lee Hodge wrote a post on the emerging Civil War blog, and he describes the officers as Law's staff, probably photographed in late 1862, which is consistent with the promotion that Law received to brigadier general. That same year, 2016, there's a discussion thread on civilwartalk.com, and it raises possible names and photo comparisons to identify the men based on that late 1862 date. In that thread is a comment by Laura Elliott, who is a historian. She is contributed to Military Images. There's a comment by Laura that opens up the possibility that the men sat for the portrait later in the war. Laura observed that the man on the bottom right, and we'll take a close-up look to see his image, that man is wearing dark cuffs and a collar with a star. It's consistent with a medical officer. And she surmised that he is Dr. Charles Thomas Tolliver, life dates 1833 to 1902, of the 4th Alabama. Another commenter in that 2016 thread followed up with a post-war portrait of Tolliver that resembles, it's a close resemblance to the man in the portrait. So Laura, I think, is onto something. If Tolliver is the medical officer, that star that I mentioned on his collar indicates he ranked as a major. That's what a surgeon ranked. Tolliver's military service record lists only his appointment as an assistant surgeon, and that rank was captain. And that was in August of 1862. But if you do some digging into muster rolls in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, they list him as being promoted to a full surgeon, that's the major and the star, in 1864. Sadly, no month is listed, but now we have some confirmation that 1864 was the date that Tolliver was promoted, and it's reasonable to conclude that the image was taken at that time. That shift, that later date, then opens up the possibilities that we can actually know who Law and his military family around him actually are. Who were they in the summer of 1864? Well, if you start doing some looking around at photographs and doing some comparisons and some research, it starts to all fall into place. The young man, that young clean-shaven man wearing the 9-button shell jacket, well, that's Law's younger brother, John Kolb Law, life dates 1841 to 1913. He served as a volunteer aide, suffered a wound at Antietam, and went on to become an enrolling officer in the Richmond, Virginia area. Now, let's go to the officer standing next to young John Law. This man, you can see him between Law and Tolliver. He is Mims Walker, M-I-M-S Walker, Mims Walker, life dates 1838 to 1903. He began his service in Company D of the 4th Alabama. Law detailed him as a courier and an unofficial aide during the Peninsula Campaign, and Walker served in this capacity until he received a promotion to first lieutenant and aide in June 1864, which is, I think, the uniform he's wearing here. Unfortunately, we cannot see the insignia on his cuffs. That would help us to really appreciate that. We also can't see his collar because that Abe Lincoln-esque beard is covering it. Now, let's go to the man sitting next to Law. He is pictured here. His name is Lee Richmond Terrell. His life dates were about 1835 to 1864. He served as a captain and assistant adjutant general on Law's staff until June of 1864, when he received an appointment as lieutenant colonel of the 47th Alabama Infantry. He's pictured here at that rank as lieutenant colonel. Terrell suffered a mortal wound at the Second Battle of Darbytown Road on October 13th, 1864. So fair to say that this image was taken in the summer of 1864. My best thinking, my best estimate, it was June, maybe July of 1864, probably June, because there was a wound that Law suffers. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we also get back to Tolliver, who is sitting on the right. Now, question becomes, when did they actually pose for this photograph? I mentioned June 1864. Where did they pose? I think it's very likely that it was in the Richmond area by an identified photographer. could have possibly been southeast of the capital in Charles City County, as mentioned in the Valentine Museum description. So there you have it, the story of an image that was lost and then found very recently. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.